Welcome to Great Power Politics. In today's lecture, we will continue talking about power, but in a little bit a different way than we talked about power in our last session. So today we will look at it much more systemic. So in the first part of the lecture, we will go into the historic context and look at the last century, more or less, and see how power continued to develop, but also how power shifts occurred and what kind of consequences they had in terms of conflict, but also in terms of cooperation. In the second part of the lecture, I then would like to kind of continue discussing the different sorts of scholar on the connection between power structures and the international system, and how important these different kind of sorts are in understanding in what kind of situation we are currently, whether we are in a conflictual or in a cooperative situation. And so I want to use this kind of lecture not just as a basis for understanding what happened historically, but also kind of see it as a lens how we can look into the future and what kind of decisions will lie ahead for us. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you.
What we want to see here is to go first back to our idea about the shift of global balance of power. So if you recall our last lecture, you know that actually we talked about the international system as being this unique environment where we have where all the states are interacting with each other, and therefore we are actually all within one system, which is not governed by some kind of formal laws or some kind of power which is superior to anybody else, but rather the anarchy of the states. So this kind of anarchy is a term which describes how that countries are in this system on an equal level. That doesn't mean that they are equal, but it means that their power they are depending on their own power, and the power structure within this international system is really kind of describing how governments interact with each other. And I want to go further in this kind of discussion today to show you different forms of power relationships, as we had already discussed in the last class, but this time I also want to kind of put some historic background on it as well. So if we kind of look at the time period in the beginning of the last century, between 1900s roughly and the beginning of the Second World War, so the first 35 to 40 years, basically we can see this as the end of the European multipolar system of power balance. What do we mean with multipolar system? Well, previously we did have a situation where the British Empire was a hegemon, but in the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, this power structure of the British Empire disappeared and became less and less important. But what we did have is that European powers on a global stage still dominated world politics. So we had a multipolar polar system where the British were concerned about the possibility of the French to become more important and kind of dominating the situation. And at the same time, there was also the problem of the rise of Germany within the European system, and this created a situation where we had like imbalances within the international system. These kind of imbalances led to a much less stable situation, which wasn't actually only disadvantageous for the most powerful countries also, but for also the less powerful countries. These kind of created uncertainty, and this uncertainty also led to other problems. So we had the kind of rigid alliance system leading to the World War I, the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, the British and the French. But in a way, this alliance wasn't really kind of very stable. What we also have to see is that the World War I drained European powers. It was a very expensive, very kind of expensive in terms of economic power, but also expensive in terms of loss of life, etc. It was a very big war which kind of drained the European countries overall. So their power declined within the international system. So this kind of loss of power created all kind of different mechanisms, some domestically, some on the international stage. So in a way, one of the maybe most obvious is here, the colonies begin to break away. So the empire, British Empire and the French Empire, both of course crumbled already before, but the end of the First World War really was the starting point for the end of the empires, and many countries, many regions wanted to be independent, and kind of the states were grumbling with how to cope with the situation. In a way, another real issue which came about was the rise of nationalism. One response on the domestic level was really that nationalism became more prominent within Europe, and the countries themselves kind of tried to become more assertive, more powerful within this framework. Another interesting part was then that other political ideas also became more important. So the rise of communism in the Soviet Union, and subsequently taking over the role in the USSR, was also a kind of a response to lack of power on the international stage as well as the domestic stage. Something which we see a little bit more in the background, but which is also kind of important, is the rise of Japan and the United States in this period. Before the second, especially the United States, is quite interesting because it emerged to become the most powerful country within the world, of course, shortly after the let's say after the end of the Second World War. But at that period, really the kind of the relative stability within the United States and the economic prosperity led to the situation that the United States became also much more active and assertive on the international stage. So we see, on the one hand, we see some kind of dynamic aspects. So on the one hand, European collapses as a global power center. So it's not the kind of the powerhouse, the ruling place in the world anymore. On the other hand, this kind of lack of power here is also kind of combined with an increase in power, predominantly seen in the United States, but also in Japan, that they are kind of emerging as more powerful countries. And that's something which we have to keep in mind, that if some regions, countries, etc., become less powerful, that means that overall the balance is shifting and other parts of the world might actually become more powerful. So we don't have just an erosion of power, we also have then an increase of power in other parts of the world. So we have to see it as a complete system in itself. If we kind of see this multipolar system, after the end of the Second World War, this very quickly became a bipolar system, which is generally seen as a higher level of stability, and then ended up in a way in the situation of the Cold War. So we had this multipolar system, which was very challenging, and also lots of people are credited as the key reason why 2 world wars could happen. But at the other hand, we had also then, after this multipolar system kind of lost its basis and some of its power structures, some others, namely the United States and especially also the Soviet Union, gained and kind of led this from a multipolar system towards a bipolar system. So we had this kind of shift from the bipolar system, from the multipolar system to the bipolar system. Now we could think about the stability of a bipolar system. And I think that's an interesting aspect. So at the end of at the beginning of or the end of the Second World War, we already have a situation where the US and the USSR see themselves, on the one hand, fighting both nationalisms, fascism in the name of Germany and also Italy and to some extent Japan, but at the same time, kind of seeing themselves as up and coming enemies for the next situation, which would be then kind of labeled later on as the Cold War. Well, but there is this interesting part again, that it is not a hot war after the Second World War. It's actually, the label Cold War, as you probably know, means that there was a conflictual situation between these two superpowers, but it did not end into a military confrontation between them, or not as into an extended military confrontation, which we could categorize as war. But it did lead to a major confrontation within this, and we all know about the nuclear arms race, which basically led to an amount of nuclear weapons within the world, which is capable of destroying it several times, and therefore increasing the risk significantly. So we shouldn't kind of see this bipolar system where we have arms races and other confrontations as an ideal situation where peaceful environments happen. But at the same time, we can see that bipolar systems, like the Cold War situation, are actually having a higher level of stability than multipolar systems as we had between the beginning of the 20th century and, let's say, at the end of the Second World War in 1945. So some aspects here are quite interesting. The one is this idea about the kind of building alliances. So the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, within the process in becoming the two superpowers, also were really trying to get as many allies as possible. That led, at one hand, to the creation of security alliances, like within the framework of the United States, the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is often seen, but also on the Soviet side as the Warsaw Pact, which is kind of combining the strengths and the military strengths of several countries in order to be a suitable opponent towards the other party. That is something which is very different, because it's a formalized alliance, very different than what we had during the Second World War, and also before, where security alliances happened, but they were shifting. They were not kind of seen as constant as the NATO and also from the Soviet side, the Warsaw Pact were. In terms of confrontation, we do have to notice that they occurred. So we did have confrontations, and some, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, were very, very close to the move from a Cold War to a hot war. And of course, if we would have this kind of situation of a hot war, that could lead very quickly to devastating situations because of the amount of arms the Soviet Union as well as the United States have at their disposal. So if we if there would have been a nuclear war, most likely we wouldn't just sit here and talk about it in this way, but it could have very likely destroyed the whole planet. Another form of war which occurred within this situation are so-called proxy wars. So some countries, most notably within Vietnam, but also Afghanistan and the Middle East, we do have situations where the Soviet Union and the United States are not fighting actively against each other a war, but through this country or a conflict within this country, which is a proxy. So this country, let's say Vietnam, different groups were supported by both sides, or by each side, and therefore a relatively small conflict suddenly escalated to a level which was much, much bigger. And these proxy wars, especially the Vietnam War, continued to be a very deadly struggle from both sides, and also did not lead to any kind of positive resolving of the conflict. Lots of lives have been lost. It is also important to mention that there is a group which is often called the non-alignment movement, the Third World Lobby for Support, which is not aligned with Indes, either to the east or the west. However, their position at times was not necessarily very strong because they did not really kind of get benefit from each of the sides. Another part which is really interesting in looking at the end of this bipolar system, unlike the multipolar system, which ended in a war, basically the First World War and then subsequently a Second World War as the ultimate end of this power distribution known from a global perspective, we do see that the bipolar system imploded rather than kind of created military conflicts. So basically the Soviet Union was not capable kind of keeping up this level of confrontation and the arms race. And Gorbachev changed the political system with Glasnost and Perestroika, and therefore it did not get resolved by external conflict, but rather by internal change. So the superpower position, in a way, was not viable from a domestic perspective in the USSR, and therefore changed in this and ended by domestic decision makers. That's also an important part which we need to remember, that global events are of course driven by external other actors, other countries, but domestic actors are also important, and domestic decisions are really important in this respect as well. Okay, so if we look at this kind of first multipolar system, then a bipolar system, and then in the beginning of the 21st century, at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s until basically very soon now, we do have a new system where the one hegemon really prevails, and that's often seen in the United States. But the question here is, are we still in this situation? If you carefully look at the literature now about the current pandemic COVID-19 crisis, what we do see is a lot of people claim that this is the end of the US as the hegemon, the superpower which is dominating everything. I want you to keep this in mind, because this is something which is really important, how we see the world, or how we predict what will happen with the world in the future. So is the US losing its hegemonic situation? Do we have a change in the global power structure again? Or are we in a situation where the power structure stays relatively constant? We will get lots of ideas why the one or the other is right. And I think that's one of the ultimate goals of this course, is to understand whether we are currently in a power struggle where we have a shift of power structure, or whether we are in a situation of stability where actually the power structure is relatively fixed and no necessarily new conflict would arise. So in a way, we should kind of say, like, one of the issues is, will this hegemonic power of the US last? In a way, we could answer this very easily and say, yeah, yes, the US is militarily stronger than any other hegemon in history. It has a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. It has a very strong arsenal of conventional weapons. Even China, which invests quite heavily into its military, is no real competitor to the vast amount of weapons the United States has. So we could say, like, okay, this really kind of shows that the US is a hegemonic actor. But even in terms of military, which is often seen as the most undisputed part of US power, we see that there are certain problems. So in a way, it is much better in terms of deterring rather than compelling. So it's built in a way to fight other military, but it's not without its fault. Also, the idea is how much does the US public have an interest in fighting wars? What we see in situations like the Iraq, Afghanistan, and others is that, of course, the United States is a much more powerful actor than these countries, but in terms of what scholars often call resolve. So how determined is the United States in winning these conflicts? They are not as determined very often, because the loss of life is really important for them. And also public opinion might not kind of be in favor so much. So US military is very strong, but at the same time, it is constrained by domestic politics and other aspects. Some other people argue that, yes, the United States is a hegemon, it's very powerful, but we do have, in a modern world like now, a lot of other organizations which are important, like. And then the question comes up, is the power of the United States restrained by these international organizations? So we have international organizations like the United Nations, we have issues like international law, we have interdependence of other actors within the G20 or the G7. So we do have lots of organizations where the world is getting together and kind of developing solutions on a global level. So we could argue that these kind of are a limiting factor for the United States. However, if we kind of see this from a perspective of Ikenberry, which I will kind of introduce in a minute, it is not necessarily a bug, so a problem for the United States, but rather a feature of their way of ruling. So Ikenberry is kind of championing the idea that these international institutions, which are created by the United States, help to foster its power position, even beyond the level of its own hegemonic power. So these organizations help to sway decisions on the international level to be preferable to the positions of the United States, even if other actors are participating in it. And so we will discuss this in more detail, but it's an interesting analysis where we see that the United States does have different, more power within these international organizations than, let's say, other actors. And this cooperation actually helps them to keep countries within this Western global order. Another scholar, Zakaria, is actually seeing the situation quite differently. He is saying that the US has a problem which is called overstretch. What does he mean by that? Well, basically, that the United States has interests in so many parts of the world, interests in so many different situations, that it is not capable of fulfilling all these desires, and therefore leading to a situation which is that it is stretched in kind of into many different sides, which leads to something like polarization within the population at the domestic level, and therefore a government paralysis where the people are so split over what to do in what kind of situation, in which conflict, that they are not capable of making effective decisions anymore, and therefore actually lead to a situation of rather more which is big, where the United States cannot lead to its full capacity, but rather is kind of ripped apart between different forms of conflict. Okay, well, let me take one step back and have a look at the work of John Ikenberry. I think if you will read quite a bit within this class about his work, but I think it's a really interesting book, which is quite helpful in understanding the international system and the American perspective on the international system. So what I want to focus on is basically his idea about the limiting factors of hegemonic power. So what he argues is that you do need a hegemon in order to kind of build up a rule-based international order, as we have within the framework of the United States. So you need this hegemon and the willingness and the ability to establish rules of action in the international sphere, and then also to enforce them. So creating international organizations like the United Nations, but at the same time also creating and enforcing that their importance is continued to be existent. Why would the country actually kind of limit its own power structure? So the way, if we could controverse this liberal hegemonic rule, we can contrast this with a purely hegemonic rule as we see it, let's say, from the British Empire. What we can see is that the British Empire was so powerful that it could actually push its will on any other actor within the global international system. So the British Empire was therefore capable of extortion of lots of revenues, as well as kind of keeping its colonies, etc., etc. But what it was not capable of was to extend the life of its hegemony beyond the situation of its power structure. So once power declined, the hegemonic system of the British Empire also declined and led to something which then became a multipolar system, and at the end of the Second World War, basically new powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, emerged as the most powerful country and left the British Empire basically in a much lower power position than it had during its hegemonic situation. So the idea about the liberal hegemonic power is that within the time frame of being a hegemon, the hegemon, in this case the United States, created international organizations which are rule-based. So they are not necessarily just a reflection of the power of the United States, but they are kind of establishing rules within the international system. So that's the first important part, that they're rule-based, But the second important part is that they are also participatory. That means that other countries can participate. So think about the United Nations, even though the US has a prominent role and the seat of the United Nations, the headquarters is in New York, etc., etc. Still, other countries are very prominent in it as well. So there is the P5, which include the British, the French, the Chinese, the Russians, besides the United States. And all of them have a specific role to play, but it also includes all the other countries and most of the countries in the world, which are all kind of participating in the organization. And therefore, this organization becomes something which is beyond just a reflection of the US power position, but an organization which might be able to kind of continue to live. And John Ikenberry sees that advantage in creating an international order in a way that he says this international order is not depending on this one hegemon. This international order can actually continue to live on even if the hegemon declines in its power structure. So if true, we will discuss this in more detail in later classes. But if this is true, that means that the international liberal order created by the US as a hegemonic power would be capable of outliving the strengths of the US and continue with different actors in the pole position or in many other positions. There are a lot of problems with this kind of thought, and I will go into this in a short while, but this should be the overview of John Ikenberry's ideas of a liberal Leviathan. There's another idea, and this is which I want to contrast with the liberal Leviathan. Of course, we have to see that this has been written in 1992, which is, of course, a much earlier phase, and therefore maybe not as relevant anymore to our current discussion. Having said that, it also shows an expectation or a hope, so to say, what will happen after the end of the Cold War. So we had in 1990, maybe the collapse of the Soviet Union, 89, and the German unification. And based on this kind of context, Francis Fukuyama wrote the book, The End of History and the Last Man. And what he wants to argue in this article is that basically there is no ideological conflict anymore. And so we are kind of entering what he called a post-war history. So that we don't have necessarily a conflictual situation, but that there's a universal acceptance of Western liberal democracies and also market economies as the final form of government. So basically that there is no conflict over the best ways to govern anymore, but a general understanding. And this kind of general understanding would as well lead to a more general acceptance of what he called Western values, and that we actually lead to a more peaceful world because the core ideas are shared. Now I want you to pause here a little bit and think about this, whether his vision roughly 30 years ago is actually something which is reflected in our current situation. Do we have a situation where we are kind of clear about what the values, the human values are, and how we have to govern? Or do we have a plurality of ideas? Do we have different forms of government, etc., which are competing with each other? I think it's safe to say that China is not following, for example, this position, and not necessarily kind of being seen as following Western liberal democratic rules. Having said that, in terms of international organizations, we do find that China is becoming much more active and kind of supporting them. And in terms of market economy, we also do see that China is very supportive of the mechanisms behind it and tries to actively save and evolve them. So just have a thought about Fukuyama's idea, how applicable they are still in our current world. I want to highlight another book, which is actually kind of written by the supervisor of Fukuyama. And around the same time, he wrote The End of History, his own book. And that kind of looked at it, it's written, it's called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. How he looked at the future was quite differently. He said that we actually don't, we have at the one hand the globalization, but we also do have a fragmentation. So he said that if we won't have a conflict between ideologies or a conflict between power structures, but rather that we would lead to a situation where civilizations, or how Huntington calls them, would conflict. And so he thinks that even though through globalization the world becomes smaller and easier to connect, we would feel much more tribal behavior by certain in certain regions, and therefore conflictual behavior between different kind of lifestyles, civilizations, rather than in terms of international, countries and the power positions of these countries. So we have here this book. I have to say, have been heavily criticized within the academic literature as well. His ideas of civilizations are often crude, and it was also seen as a very confrontational way of kind of describing the future. Having said that, a lot of the conflict which we have seen in terms of Islamism and xenophobia connected around Islamism follows these ideas of civilizations and conflict of civilization. So in a way, why did I kind of put these three books up here? I can say, like, well, we have different conceptualizations of the international system and the relevance of different entities, right? So at the one hand, we think and put the forefront the nation states and international organizations. The second one thinks more about ideas how to govern, and the last one thinks about identity in forms of civilizations. So these kind of different concepts are really important in our prediction of what will happen within the future of the world, and how we can what we can expect to happen, like conflict cleavages to emerge. So I want you to kind of reflect on that and say, like, if we kind of read in the literature or even in common newspaper articles, etc., that certain cleavages arise between different parts of the world, between different powers in the world, or between different countries, that we have to say that there is a theoretical kind of framing within the background, which is kind of driving the understanding of these kind of conflicts. So we do have to see that this kind of theoretical framing are really important in us making predictions about where the future will head to. Okay. Well, so if we think about shift of power, we have to ask ourselves what kind of theoretical background we are looking at, and that will kind of reflect whether we are thinking about a stable situation or an unstable situation as well. I want to highlight in this slide actually the ideas how we can understand international organizations within this kind of framework of different theoretical ideas. So if we kind of go back to Ikenberry's idea of the international liberal order, so we can see that most of the institutions which have been built in the international system are kind of certain way of capitalistic and democratic system. So we do find that the World Bank is kind of thinking about market liberalization. So is the IMF. Institutions like the G8 or G7 nowadays and the G20 are kind of in the same realm. But we also see that other forms of organizations are kind of forming. For example, situations like BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are also becoming and more important actors. And they're not necessarily built on the same kind of ideas of capitalism and democracy. And one question we have to ask ourselves is, why should new emerging powers care about the current international order? What I want to say with this is that, yes, the current international order is kind of squeezed into the direction of liberal values, Western values, so to speak. But does this mean that it is there for the future? Is not necessarily the case. So it could be that international liberal order can also be changed, and the values within this international liberal order could change. I want to give you an example which is kind of describing exactly this in 1 second. So if we look at the BRICS in this situation, they are not necessarily bound by ideology. They're not bound by a specific international idea. The only kind of situation which actually puts them together is the idea that they are economically becoming wealthier and want to kind of exchange information on how to deal with this growing wealth. So in a way, they are not put together by ideology, but rather by the situation that they have taken off at a relatively similar time, and therefore find themselves in similar situations. So that's also part of the international order, but is it really kind of skewed by the liberal organizations? Well, we can debate this in our class, but I don't think that this really is a good example for that. And that highlights another aspect which is really important, and that is that we have a dynamic shift of economic power. This kind of shift is, in a way, can be seen from the West towards the East, which is maybe not necessarily surprising. China and India have 1/3 of the world's population. So that means that they should also have a high part of its productivity. They do have high growth rates, even though in the last couple of years, or maybe in the last year, this has been faltering to many kind of unknown situations as the current pandemic, but also, of course, other economic issues. But having said that, it seems at the moment that they are kind of much better prepared to cope with the current economic challenges than Western countries, including Europe and the United States. So in a way, it is likely that they keep growing. Why is that likely? Because they have a relatively young population and the wealth level is not so high. So it seems easier for them to actually kind of increase growing and therefore also becoming even more powerful in the future. Well, if we kind of look at this, we also kind of observe that there is a shift of technology and technological balance of power, so to speak. So while we had all the, like for a very long time, we had development of new technologies within the West, including Japan, and then kind of building things within countries like China and India. We more and more see that actually native companies from India and China are taking over as technology leaders, developing better technology and being ahead of the curve rather than catching up or producing for the West. So we will kind of, it is to expect that we have an inclusive and economic shift from these countries to, from the West towards China and India. So it is quite likely that, for example, that India will, in our lifetime, overtake Germany as an economic power. So we can also change the challenges to these kind of international institutions. So on the one hand, we have this kind of reflection of the power shift on the economic terms. Does it really kind of also reflect the power shift within these international organizations? You might have actually heard that there has been a debate about the position of the World Health Organization and the conflict of whether they are too friendly towards the policies of China or whether the United States is wrongfully accusing him of them. But this shows that countries become more sensitive about what the internal power structure of these organizations are. In what we do see that on the formal structure, a lot of the organizations are not reflecting the overall power structure in the global level. So for example, in the IMF and the World Bank, small countries like the Benelux countries have a larger share in voting than China has. So in a way, China is challenging this Washington consensus. It has been seen as underrepresented in these organizations and therefore kind of not being willing to support them so much. And that goes back very much to our idea, which we had previously, that if the international organizations are not reflecting the current power structure, do countries which emerge as newly powerful, do they actually kind of support these international organizations? Or do they change them? And maybe not just change them, but maybe kind of create rival organizations. In this way, we can see as one of the key examples, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is one of the organizations created by China in order to kind of create a competition towards other Western organizations. One is the Asian Development Bank, but of course also the International Monetary Fund. So this is the first attempt to kind of use the same ideas of an international order participating, having other countries participating, but under different voting rights, different constraints, and therefore again creating a situation where everybody can participate, but which is kind of tiered towards China rather than the United States. So if we look at the voting rights within the AIIB, we do see that China is a pivotal player, being more powerful than the others and is capable of blocking any kind of new project which others are suggesting. So it will not be possible to kind of have projects without the consent of China within the AIIB. That is something which is common in the International Monetary Fund with the United States, but also in the ADB with Japan. So it's not an uncommon feature, but it is interesting because it is kind of putting itself directly against the Western-led international system, still kind of being participatory, but under different leadership. And if you look at the organization, what we can see on this map is that many countries participated, including actors like South Korea, most European countries, Brazil, Australia, not the United States, not Canada, and not Japan, but even those countries kind of left the loophole open that they would be able to join at one point if the organization becomes powerful enough. And so what we do see here is that this is not necessarily kind of fixed in stone which international organizations are existent, but rather that there is a market and depending on how suitable what organization is, and also how the power structure is, this is reflected in the existence of international organizations. So in a way, I want you to think about two questions and then maybe pause the video for a little bit and kind of write down what your ideas are. So we could think about the shift of power in two different ways. Once, do we see a change towards developing countries? So countries which previously have not been very developed are becoming more powerful. Let's say countries like India and China have for quite a long time underperformed and have been living in relative poverty. Is this kind of change what we see here actually just an acceleration of these countries catching up with the rest of the world, becoming in the aftermath of it, of course, more powerful because of their population structure and the sheer size of them. But in a way, this should be very much seen because alleviating countries from poverty towards becoming powerful members. Or do we see something very different? And that is, do we see a power change within the international system, where we have certain actors which become powerful, on the same time we have decline of other actors? So do we actually see that the United States are declining in power because China is increasing in its power, or are these kind of phenomena which are independent? I really would like you to kind of put your thoughts in, write down these thoughts, pause here, write them down, and then later on publish them or put them up on our Padlet site, and we can discuss them also in our class tomorrow. So the real idea, like, what drives this kind of change of power? Is it increasing development in certain countries, or do we see a power shift from one region to another? Okay, I hope you have written this down. And I want to kind of take the last part of this lecture to kind of see economic performance from different angles. And if we kind of look at this, and also how we can kind of misinterpret it maybe in certain ways. So if you look at the performance between, let's say, 1950 and 2010, based on the percentage contribution of regional countries' GDP to global GDP, we see a very interesting kind of shift within regions, but also within countries. So in this way, we can try to identify some kind of long-term trends. So it's also not that I'm looking here at the last 5 years and say like, okay, this is what's happening at the moment, but rather kind of want to look at it in a longer period of time. So here you have the regional kind of performance. Before you kind of move on, tell me, what do you think, which countries are we seeing? Who is the brown line? Who is the blue line? Who are kind of more or less stable, but in the recent years are kind of the beginning of this century start to decline? Who is this kind of red line, which is at the lower level, but then suddenly has a drop and then kind of stabilizes again? Another one which is quite flat here is a region, basically not much going on throughout the tier period from the 1950s to 2010. We have a couple of regions which are on a lower level. Then we have one which is constantly increasing, but more and more accelerating in the last couple of decades. If we would have put this up to up to now, we would see that even stronger. So now have a guess which countries we are talking, or which regions we are talking about. Well, we can see that the green one is Asia, excluding Central Asia. We can see that North Africa, so this is the one which is really increasing. Then we see Western Europe, constant thing, like since the 1950s, first kind of stable, but then constantly declining. North America, higher level, then also lower level in the 60s, where there were countries like Germany and the UK and France kind of accelerated again. But then also we see in this last part here, especially like a constant drop. Interesting is Eastern Europe, economically speaking, to the 1990s. We have a relatively stable situation, a little bit of a decline. We have a sudden drop and then a stabilization on a lower level. Of course, this is the implosion of the Soviet Union, which had a big impact on the region. Here, more or less stable, not much progress is seen on Latin America. Africa, Middle East, Oceania are all on a lower level. Middle East had like a little bit of a boost and a decline, then relatively stable. What you would see in the last 10 years is actually a decline as well. So we do see that especially this Asian region is really kind of the driver of economic development. So just think about this. Does this kind of support our hypothesis that actually power is moved, at least economic power is moved from the west towards east? Well, you might argue that in this group, we have many different countries. India and China are not necessarily friends. Also, especially in the beginning of this kind of increase, we do is that a big part is not kind of driven by China, but probably by Japan, which is also kind of included in this region, but very often kind of included in the Western Hemisphere because it is very close to the United States and to Europe and has a political system which is very similar to it. Yeah. So maybe it doesn't really make sense to actually kind of split situations in regions. Rather, we should look at countries individually. So what I just said, we can kind of is summarized here. I don't go into detail, you can read it again, but you do see that that basically that Asia is defined as the kind of key area where we have this increase. If we look at the country performance, the picture looks actually quite different. Right? We do have that the overall most powerful country for a long time was the United States, and then, but we do see that the one which is really increasing in recent years is China, and to some to some aspects also India. In the same time, we had a peak of Japan, rather than, which is kind of leading into a decline in the last 20 years so far. And here again, we do have on a much lower level European countries like Germany, France, United Kingdom, etc. Interestingly, we see the same kind of situation, as we said before, with the USSR and the Soviet Union, which had this kind of drop, which is kind of politically motivated. So in a way, we could argue from this that maybe it's not so much about regions, but it's actually about two dominant kind of countries. We should look at the United States and maybe China, and to some aspect, India. So what we want to say here is that, in a way, what kind of factor do we need to look at if we kind of look at global shifts? Do we need to look at them from a national perspective, a country perspective? Do we need to look at them from a regional perspective? Or do we need to look at them from developed countries versus developing countries? All of this affects highly our predictions for the future. And all of this is really important into saying like what kind of conflicts might arise within the future. So I want to kind of highlight here that we do have some framing which is really important to understand this. But what we do see from an economic power change is that we do see a shift from the west to the east. And that doesn't seem to be a short-term trend in the last 10, 15 years, but rather a long-term trend which is going on continuously since the end of the Second World War. What we do see is that this economic shift is recognized by most people in economic terms, like most scholars in economic terms. But we don't see the same kind of change within the military power. And I want you to think about whether this is just the first step, so that economic power will translate eventually into military power in the future, and we will have a political shift as well. Or if we should see this as separate entities, that political power and military power on the one side and economic power are not necessarily connected directly, and therefore on a political sphere we will not see the same kind of shifts we see in the last 50 years on the economic side. So that is one of the key parts which I want to talk about in the next kind of questions, where we look at countries specifically, go through them, see their advantages and their disadvantages, their problems they're having politically, economically, militarily, and kind of evaluate their positions, and therefore kind of look at what the future might bring for these countries and the regions at large. So I want you to use these theoretical conceptualizations, which we had discussed until now, and kind of put them into, or kind of connecting them well to this assessment of certain regions and countries, and therefore kind of enabling us to kind of predict, or at least speculate on how power shifts will kind of continue in the future, and also how this kind of affects stability, regional stability and global stability, and identifies certain new conflict scenarios. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please write down as many questions as possible. Tomorrow we will discuss this in more detail, and we'll talk about we'll kind of, I'm very looking forward to hearing what your input on this. Thanks, guys, and I look forward to seeing you. Take care. Bye.
This morning I woke, restless and heady, with blood pulsing fierce in the veins.